this preserve area was parceled out and had several owners that intended to develop it when the county bought it, but it was also where people had kind of their own sort of illegal recreation, if you will, and illegal dumping site. So where the buildings and parking lot are located were already compromised. There were already illegal roads that were in and out, and so the county took advantage of that. Instead of making new roads, cutting down new trees, they just took advantage of the fact that this had already kind of been discovered. The parking lot, in fact, was a Superfund cleanup site because it was a dump that had, heavy metals and all that horrible stuff.
Oh, geez.
But it's better now. And you can see when the boardwalks were created, they went around the trees instead of cutting the trees down. So we built the education center around what was already there. So that's a bit of conservation in action, if you will.
Okay.
So one of our early spring wildflowers are the violets. They're probably familiar to most of you. You've probably heard of violets. There's many different species of violet. They're found throughout the entire northern hemisphere. They have this interesting flower shape. It's called guttural because it's shaped like a throat. You see the little spur that sticks out the back?
Yeah.
That little spur on the very underside of the flower, that has nectar in it. So in order to get the reward, the pollinator has to crawl through the throat to get to the nectar,
okay.
and so doing gets covered in pollen so that when it visits the next flower, it's going to transfer that pollen. Pollinators have a way of recognizing shapes and colors, and it's been compared to humans traveling in an unfamiliar territory and feeling hungry and recognizing the golden arches, and you know exactly what you're going to get, you know exactly how much it's going to cost, and you know exactly what it's going to taste like. Insects, pollinators have the same ability, so that they can recognize what they know is they're going to get, how much it's going to cost, and what it's going to taste like. So that's how they can be very specific as to which flowers they visit. Some are born with that. Some insects are born with that innate knowledge, and so there are certain flowers that have only one species of pollinator because they're born looking for that one flower.
Are there male and female trees on one tree, or are they only
The male and female flowers on the oak tree are on the same tree. Some trees have male and female on separate plants, like the hollies do, but oaks, they're on the same plant. The way that they prevent self-pollination is the timing. The males release all their pollen and fall off, and then the females become ripe and they can receive the pollen from another tree. Because we had so much rain this winter, and especially last summer, the creek hasn't dried out. Believe it or not, it's moving extremely slowly westward towards Lake Tarpon, where it empties out. But it's so pretty through here. Mm-hmm. If only it weren't for the guns. The red fuzz on the tree trunks, that's an air plant. It's a bromeliad. Are y'all familiar with bromeliads?
Yes.
Bromeliads, they're a popular landscape plant. A pineapple is a type of bromeliad where it has that kind of crown-shaped top. These are flowering plants that produce airborne seeds. It's not the pollen that flies in the air, it's the seeds of these plants. And that's how they get from tree branch to tree branch. They germinate on the tree branch and then grow. They're not parasitic. They're not getting any nutrition whatsoever from their host. They're just hanging on and having a nice place in the sun. We have several different species of air plants. These flowering plants are related to Spanish moss, another bromeliad that hangs in the branches of trees. The red coloration that you can see in this lighting, that's a response to the trees, the deciduous trees, the tupelos. When they lose their leaves in the winter, these air plants are exposed to more sunlight, and they respond to that by producing more of this red pigment to act as sunscreen to protect them from harmful UV rays. Once the canopy fills in again and it becomes much more shady, they go from this red color to an olive green. So they can change.
So those are air plants?
They're air plants, they're bromeliads,
yeah.
They're epiphytic plants. They grow on other plants. They're not parasitic plants. This is a healthy maple, but you can see all the little air plants that are hanging on the branches. We've got some Spanish moss hanging down there. That's one of the tillandsias, and the little needle leaves as well. So this tree is supporting quite a load of epiphytic plants. All these plants are the result of little seeds having blown onto the bark of this tree and germinating and taking hold. These, actually in some parts, you can see little air plants growing on the metal railing. There's some baby ones here. They can't generally get too big because the metal is so slippery. When they get too big, they might fall off. But it does underscore the fact that these are not parasites, because they cannot be parasitizing this metal mesh, right?
Yes, yeah. That's true. There's a pine.
Here's a pine, yeah.
Wow.
And you can see the majority of the trunk is free from the epiphytic growth, but there are a few that have been able to establish and take hold. Hopefully they'll get to be flowering size so they can release those seeds after the flowers have been pollinated before they fall off. But you can also see around the base of the pine tree the chunks of bark that just naturally slough off as the tree grows in diameter.
What kind of pine is it?
That one's a slash pine. The slash pines, we have 3 pines: the slash pine, the longleaf, and the sand pine. The slash pine likes to live down where it's lower and wetter, and the longleaf pine likes to live where it's higher. We'll see some longleafs when we get into the real uplands. We're about to leave the wetlands and go way uphill. The leaf looks like it's diseased. It's all congested and brown. That is part of the leaf that is covered in the spore-producing structures.
Up top here, yeah.
Up on top, yeah, that top third of the leaves that are all bunched up.
Yeah.
Those are hundreds and maybe even thousands of tiny little spore-producing structures, each one containing 32 spores. So ferns produce billions of spores that can drift again in the wind and land someplace suitable to grow into the next generation of ferns. Again, this leaf is just covered in that spore-producing structures, so it no longer photosynthesizes. It no longer acts like the leaves that don't produce spores. It is just a reproductive frond, and again the spores drift off. And it's called cinnamon fern because of the color of this fertile frond. It's the color of a cinnamon stick. It's not the source of cinnamon. They also grow in clumps. You can see these individual ferns forming almost trunk-like shapes, whereas the royal fern, well, no, the royal fern does the same, but those two are some of our clump-forming ferns rather than the ferns that tend to run around like the swamp fern here. Swamp fern is characterized this time of year by that really pretty bronze-colored as the new leaves emerge right ahead of the rainy season. Last year's fronds are looking pretty rough. But they've done their job, they've produced the spores, and this is a new generation from the same rootstock. They don't need to grow from a spore every year. The same plant can send up leaves and produce spores year after year, exactly. Watch your footing through here. The roots are a little bit trippy. So we've come all the way uphill. We've come all the way up out of the wetland and up into the upland, and it only takes a foot or two of elevation to completely change the soil, the plants, and the animals that inhabit these different landscape types. We're walking on oak leaves and pine needles, 2 plants that are associated with more upland environments. We still have ferns. Ferns aren't just these weaklings. These are an upland species of fern. This is a fern called bracken, and it has this one leaf that's divided into these major divisions and then divided again, and then into these kind of wavy divided shape. So this is just one leaf of the bracken. It has a very strong leaf stem called the petiole, so that it can resist wilting. So it can live in sand. I mean, you can see the soil here is just sand. Down in the wetlands, it was muck, nice, rich, organic muck. So living in sand is challenging because the water races through, and so does the nutrient. So these are very well adapted plants to the upland. We have the saw palmettos, the oak trees, the grapevines that are covering that small oak there. So these are all species associated with more upland. And you can see the different leaf, two different species of oak. There's a water oak with its oar-shaped or a paddle-shaped leaf. This is a live oak, one of the evergreen oaks, with a very thick, almost cardboard-like leaf.
Target practice is the last thing.
This is an oak.
Oh,
This is also an oak.
Oh,
This is a
this-
sand live oak.
And that's not dead. I mean, that hasn't fallen over. That's
It
how it
fell
grows.
over,
Oh, it did fall.
but it
Okay.
didn't die. The will to survive was strong with this one, and it's doing fine. And the sand live oak has these characteristic, very, very thick canoe-shaped leaves. So here's one that I pulled off the tree, and here's last year's leaf that's still here. It hasn't decomposed yet. The oaks are not adapted to fire, and fire is a very normal part of natural Florida. Before we got here, lightning could start a fire in the north of the state and burn all the way down to the Okefenokee.
Wow.
Or no, what's it called? Everglades. It could burn all the way down, and so it would just
From the
clean
Okefenokee to the Everglades.
from the Okefenokee to the Everglades. And the pines are very well adapted to that, and the palmettos are very well adapted to that. But the oaks are not. They don't like burning. So it used to be that oaks were only found on riverbanks, where the fire wouldn't get. Just 10% of peninsular Florida consisted of oak forest. The rest was all pine and palmetto. But that switched because we've stopped allowing these fires to burn. But the oaks do have some defense against fire, and the sand live oak makes these very substantial leaves that can collect rainwater. And so if fire starts to approach, it could sizzle out in the apron of these persistent leaves that surround the sand live oak. So there's offense and defense in nature. This is another one of our deciduous oaks. It's called the blue jack oak because it has this pretty bluish white
Really?
hairs on the underside of the leaf. They get a little bit more pronounced over time. But the blue jack oak, it's not a very common oak. I was really hoping that I could find some female flowers on one of these oaks, but it looks like they just haven't quite made
Do
it
they
yet.
turn into acorns too?
They
or-
will, yeah, they'll produce an acorn. So this strange growth on this oak tree does no benefit to the oak. This is what happens when this wasp species found just the right thing. It was looking for a bud that was going to be a male inflorescence. Remember those little caterpillary things that I showed you before? That's what this was intended to be. But the wasp stung that bud and inserted its venom, which is modified to be a plant growth hormone mimic. So the wasp's venom signaled the plant to start growing this useless tissue for the plant, but beneficial to the wasp, because after she stings that bud, she lays an egg. And so the plant then grows this weird tissue, and the baby begins, when it hatches, to eat that tissue. It gets worse because we've got the one wasp that creates the gall and lays its egg, and the egg hatches and grows into a little grub that's feeding in there. Another wasp detects this and flies in and puts her really long stinger down into that grub and lays her egg. When her egg hatches, it eats the first wasp species grub, and then it leaves a gall that it didn't even have to make.
My goodness.
It's not Snow White out here, folks.
No.
And,
No,
that's
insects
just a
have the
particular species
worst, yeah.
all around
They're
this
worse than
tree.
us.
Like those wasps would
Correct.
have to live within
Correct. They're
the
very
area of this
specific.
tree, yeah.
They're very specific, and oaks do host quite a few of these gall-forming wasps. These wasps are so incredibly small. That's the kernel that is at the center of that gall. That's what the adult fit inside.
Oh my
So
goodness.
That's what the adult.
the adult fit was actually curled up right inside that kernel.
Wow.
So, and there's even smaller ones than that. So we're gonna hopefully, if I open the kernel, a wasp might fly out. I've seen it happen.
Really?
I think this one's pretty old. We're doing a class on galls. I
Yes.
told you about the researcher. It's the galls that she studies in the short oaks.
10 o'clock. That's beautiful.
So this is what you're looking at. And these organisms that are covering this branch are lichen.
Yeah,
Very
lichen,
good,
yeah.
yeah. And they're not plant, they're not fungus.
They're the air thing again?
They're another epiphyte in this
Epiphyte.
case. Yep, this is an epiphytic. Several different species of epiphytic lichen. There's the shield lichen there
Yeah.
that's like a
That's
piece of paper.
beautiful.
And this one's called usnea, which means beard.
Oh, so this
So
is
you have
like
3 different kinds there.
so this is lichen too.
That's a lichen too, yeah.
Okay, because I only thought this
okay,
one was.
sorry.
Right. A lot of people aren't familiar with these
Yeah.
these are called the fruticose type lichen that are more three-dimensional than the shield type lichens.
Now, isn't there two animals in there? Yeah,
well,
algae.
yeah, there's actually up to 4.
Okay.
There's a
Well-
fungus, an algae, a bacteria, and a yeast. And the different combinations of the different species of those things allow for the diversity of lichens. This is not a lichen. It is an air plant. That's another one of our bromeliads. That's a Spanish moss relative called ball moss. And you can kind of see the relation to Spanish moss. But these, again, are flowering plants that have those airborne seeds that, in this case, it landed on a branch that just didn't last long. So this little branchlet is falling down, and eventually when it hits the ground, all these things are going to get covered up with leaves, and they won't be able to photosynthesize anymore. We don't go around putting them back in the trees. We just have to leave things, except sometimes. Now, there's basically 4 different types of land plants, just 4. There's the moss, which represents what modern species of a very ancient lineage of land plants. These are among the very first to colonize the land, the true mosses. That's as tall as they get. And they also reproduce by spores. They came along a long time before insects, and everything was left to the wind and the rain. So they're low growing, they don't have any vascular system, they can't move water through their bodies. They have to rely on rain to provide all the water they need. They reproduce by spores, again, because there were no pollinators, there were no flowers yet. Moving along in a little bit more complexity, we get to the ferns, which do have that plumbing. They can get to be a little bit taller. They're not as dependent on rainwater because they have roots. They can actually search for some water. Moving up a little beyond that, we have the conifers. Again, no insects, no pollinators, no flowers. Everything is left to the wind. So pine trees are another group of plants that depend on the wind to send their pollen out into the air, to attach itself to the sticky female cones. They have cones that make pollen and cones that make seeds, but still no flowers. And then from the cone-bearing trees developed the flowering plants. They're the most diverse. So mosses, ferns, conifers, and flowering plants. And the flowering plants are the most diverse. They came around about the same time as the insects. And so teamwork and competition at the same time. The plants depended on the insects for pollination, but they were also trying to keep themselves from being eaten. This pink lichen. It's not something you see every day, especially in town. This is a species of lichen that isn't the leafy type, and it isn't the three-dimensional type. It's more like paint. So those are the 3 growth habits of lichen: the leafy, the three-dimensional, and the ones that are like paint. This one's called Baton Rouge or Christmas lichen because of that red color. and it's a sign of clean air. Lichen can be very sensitive to air pollution, and you're not going to see much of this in our urban county. But in a place like Brooker, where the air is really clean, you're going to see a lot of it. But if you take a look, this whole branch is just covered in tiny little plants and lichen and plants called liverworts and mosses and everything. So there's lots and lots and lots of oxygen being produced on the branches of this tree, not just from the leaves of the tree. The pawpaw, it has these very fragrant, very delicate, former flower, big showy white petals, very, very fragrant, long leaves. This is a plant that's essential for the zebra swallowtail butterfly. The larvae only feed on the leaves of the pawpaw. Pawpaw might be familiar to some of y'all from further north. There's a tree called a pawpaw that's related to this that produces a large edible fruit. The fruit of this pawpaw is edible, but we leave them for the gopher tortoise so that they can move the pawpaws around. There's another one flowering just through there. You can see the larger banner-like flowers. I'll try not to break them this time. Just here. The pretty pawpaw.
Okay.
That's the flower. Little easily overlooked shrub. It's one of the blueberry complex. And you can see that the fruit developing here is looking like a blueberry. And when it's mature, it looks very much like a blueberry. And you can eat it, but it's mostly seeds. We leave things for the wildlife to eat and disperse the seeds. The flowers are urn-shaped. There's a flower, and all the petals are fused into that kind of cup shape. This one has also these kind of blue-green, kind of reflective leaves that allows it to grow in bright sunlight. I've been talking about this thing, trying to come up with a common name, and I can't. I only got the Latin. The ranger here calls it dangleberry, so if you choose, you could call it that. But it's within the blueberry complex, but it's not in the same genus as blueberry. But you can tell
It looks very similar.
there's a familial resemblance. Yeah.
Now, what is this again?
What are these again?
These are Spanish. This is Spanish moss.
Oh, that's fine. Okay.
Yeah, this is the flowering plant that is not a true moss. There's the seed capsule from last year. The little.
Yeah.
There's the seed capsule from last year, and this is what had the little fluffy seeds that flew out.